Okay, great. We're about ready for our next presentation. I'd like to introduce Professor Jonathan Jensen, who will be presenting on sponsorship revenue forecasting for sports organizations, a survival analysis approach. I'd like to welcome Professor Jensen to the stage.
I'm Jonathan Jensen. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you for the pleasure of your time. The genesis behind this research is really not a whole lot different from what a lot of you are doing, in that we're taking a more advanced quantitative research methodology and applying it to a new area. It just so happens that survival analysis has just never been really applied to sports marketing, and I think it took someone like me who spent 15 years in the industry and then went back and got a PhD and learned about these methodologies to think about how else it might be applied. I'll start out here talking a little bit about, the NFL, as we all know, is dependent largely on broadcast rights fees and television revenue. So the overall percentage of revenue for the NFL, last year they had about 1.2 billion in revenue or 1.2 billion in revenue for sponsorship versus about 12 billion revenue overall. So only about 10% of its revenue comes from sponsorship. When you start talking about nonprofit organizations, and there was an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago about the U.S. Olympic Committee. In their most recent financial statements in 2014, it showed that more than a third of its overall revenue comes from sponsorship, 35%. And that's fairly common for nonprofit organizations. When you start thinking about global nonprofit organizations, and the context for my research in this study is FIFA and the International Olympic Committee. 32% of FIFA's event-driven revenue comes from sponsorship. And when you think about the International Olympic Committee, their top sponsorship program and their domestic sponsorship, it's up to 35%. They've got around $8 billion in revenue per quadrennial, and like 2.8 billion of that is from sponsorship. So it's a large percentage of the organization's overall revenue. However, those of you who work in this environment in sports marketing and sponsorship know that really the only tool that you have right now that you can use to project revenue, not 1 to 2 years, but 5 to 10 years out, being very forward-thinking, which we all want to do nowadays, is really this renewal rate, which is just simply the aggregated overall percentage, historical percentage of sponsors that renew each time their sponsorships come up for renewal. Well, if you're a statistician like these guys, you think to yourself, well, let me say, the renewal rate is just an aggregated measure of central tendency. I mean, it really doesn't tell you very much. It doesn't tell you anything about when these sponsorships are most susceptible to ending. If you think about the lifetime of a sponsorship, you've got a beginning part, a middle part, and an end part. It really doesn't tell you anything about that. And then it also doesn't tell you anything about the duration of the sponsorship, how long they actually last. So it's really, from a statistical standpoint, it's just an inappropriate and inefficient measure. And if you're Lisa Baird, I don't know if Lisa's here today, she's scheduled to be at the conference, who's the CMO of the United States Olympic Committee, who came from the NFL, and the article in the Wall Street Journal, you might have seen, talked about how important sponsorship is to our organization. She's tearing her hair out, just thinking, how can I better understand the potential revenue into the future from sponsorship with really these inefficient metrics. So that's really the problem that this research is attempting to tackle. Well, the answer, at least the answer that I'm proposing, is a methodology called survival analysis. I don't know if anybody's here from the health field or biosciences, biotech, but survival analysis is very common in the health field. And what it's used is to look at the duration of a person's lifetime. And the idea is if you have a cancer diagnosis or if you have a transplant, survival analysis then measures the time after that point. And hopefully that person lives a long time, but also measures, well, if that person dies, what are the factors that might have contributed to that? The reason why it's applied in the medical field is that it can handle censored observations. Censored observations are essentially people who are still alive. The event in question that you're studying, which is the person dying, hasn't occurred yet. So it's appropriate to look at large data sets that involve people who are still living and also people who have died. Because when you look at these durations statistically, you don't want to just look at people who have died. You want to look at people who have died and people who are still living. So this is the methodology that I'm applying to sponsorships, because it's really the same situation. Obviously, the event in question is very different. You have someone dying in the medical field. Here in sponsorship, it's the end of the sponsorship. While, of course, not as tough as someone dying, it's still an event that both sides of the relationship want to avoid, right? These sports organizations that I've showed you, like FIFA and the IOC and the USOC, they want sponsorships to go on as long as possible because it's an important source of revenue. And obviously for the brand, the sponsoring brand, they've invested a tremendous amount of time and energy and resources towards this sponsorship. So it's really a more appropriate methodology, but it just hasn't been applied in this area before. What survival analysis provides you, here's some, give you an idea of some of the sponsorships we're talking about. In total, it's about 72 historical sponsorships dating back to the early 80s. These are the sponsors that have served as top sponsors for the IOC. Some of the most valuable brands in the world, as you're probably aware: Coca-Cola, IBM, Samsung, Visa. And these are the sponsorships that have been global sponsors with FIFA, brands like Adidas and Gillette, global sponsors. In total, our data set's about 72 sponsors, but the important part is it's a longitudinal data set. It goes all the way back into the 80s, and we're studying the duration of these sponsorships. What survival analysis allows you to do is, again, the renewal rate is just one aggregated measure of central tendency. What the survival analysis allows you to do is it provides three different metrics, and I'm going to walk you through what those are. The first one is the Kaplan-Meier survivor function. And the survivor function, it's a probability function that starts at 1, meaning 100% of the sponsorships have survived at the beginning point, and it gradually goes down all the way to 0 when theoretically all sponsorships have ended, or again, going back to the medical field, everybody has died, which they would eventually do. So just to give you an idea of the, this is a depiction of the survivor functions for both FIFA global partnerships and top Olympic sponsorships. What I wanted to point out is a couple interesting things, and if you want to look at this is a depiction of it, the actual graph from Stata that was generated is in the paper, and you can look at that. The important thing here is look at the steep drop in the first 2 time periods. In both the Olympics and World Cups, the duration of these sponsorships are based on a quadrennial, or 4 years. Look at the steep drop in the beginning of the sponsorship relationship. Sponsorships are much more likely to end early on in the relationship. And just comparing the two, you see that the FIFA sponsorships are much more likely to end early on in the relationship than the top Olympic sponsorships. But interestingly, after those first couple quadrennials, the first 8 years, things really start to level out. And a smaller and smaller percentage of the overall sponsorships end up ending as you move through the relationship. Very interesting. I'll talk next about the hazard rate. The hazard rate or hazard function is a little different from the survivor function in that it's actually measuring the probability that the sponsorship is going to end in each specific time period. And for these two sponsorships, it ranges from around 0.3 or so, meaning about 30% of the sponsorships have ended, all the way down to 0 when no sponsorships end during a particular time period. So whereas the survivor function goes from 1 all the way down to 0, the hazard rate usually is from about 0 to 0.3. Here's the easiest thing is just to graph it. And again, you see here for both the Olympic sponsorships that I've talked about and the top sponsorships, the hazard rate is highest in the beginning of the relationship, very early on. And this is consistent with the theoretical framework for this study, which is exchange theory. Exchange theory means there's always this kind of feeling out period and the exchange of resources back and forth between the brand and the sponsor as they kind of learn about each other, learn about their objectives. So this is consistent with the theory, but when I started this research, having worked in sponsorship for a long time, I actually thought that perhaps it would steadily increase over time, meaning when you start a sponsorship, everything is optimistic and you've entered into this agreement and you're really excited about it, and that it would be much more unlikely in the beginning of the relationship for the sponsorship to end, but then as you went on and you perhaps from the brand side of the relationship, you've achieved your objectives, or from the other side, you realize that it's not really working out. I thought perhaps that the hazard rate would actually increase over time. So, but the more I thought about the theoretical framework, this kind of made sense. So the hazard rate for the sponsorship ending for both the top Olympic sponsorships and the FIFA sponsorships is highest early on in the relationship. And then it kind of smooths out and gets lower and lower, to the point, essentially what this is telling us is that once you get 4, 5, 6 time periods into the relationship, which we're talking about, 20, 24 years for these long-term global sponsorships, it's going to be much more easy to keep that sponsor. And again, from a theoretical standpoint, it makes sense because you've understood each other's objectives, you've figured out how to make it work together. But it was a little counterintuitive when I first started thinking about it. The last metric I want to talk about is the median lifetime. And this is a metric that we can generate from the survival analysis methodology that really looks at how long these sponsorships last. And I'll just talk for a minute about kind of the main implication of this application of the median lifetime. So let's look here. These are durations for Olympic sponsorships. The bar in the middle is once I've computed the median lifetime for the sponsorship. And going back to our survivor function, the median lifetime is the exact time at which the survivor function is 0.5. What that means is half of the sponsorships have ended and half of them are still continuing. So it's that medium point where half have ended, half have continued on. So it's really a much better metric than a renewal rate or a measure of central tendency, because it takes into account both the sponsorships that are continuing and the sponsorships have ended. And for top sponsorships, you see it's 10.81 years. Now, if you're using a typical methodology, you're going to have to do one of two things. The red bar means you're going to have to omit all of the observations that have not ended yet. So you're going to essentially, let's just take the sponsorships who have all ended, essentially, because you know what their duration is, right? So you're going to have to omit all the ones that are still continuing. And you end up with a duration of 8.44 years if you omit the ones that are still alive today. The IOC, for example, has 12 sponsors that are still there. Or the more typical approach is the one on the right, which means you simply cut it off in today's time frame. You say, 2015, we're going to cut it off then, and let's look at all the durations of the sponsorships based on kind of truncating at present day. And for that, if you do that, which includes all the sponsorships that are continuing, plus all the ones who have previously ended, you end up with a duration of 12.14 years. So the median lifetime really ends up right in the middle. And again, I believe it's more of an accurate accounting of how long these actual sponsorships last. Here's the graph for World Cup sponsorships, and what's interesting to me is you have a different situation here. Again, if you omit the sponsorships that are continuing today, I think there's 7 global FIFA sponsors right now, you get 9 years. If you truncate at present day, similar result, you get 11.24 years. But if you look at the median lifetime, which again takes into account both the historical sponsorships that have ended, plus the ones that are still continuing today, you actually get a much smaller amount, 6.12 years. Now, you might look at this and you might say, let's go back to the IOC. You might say, well, 8 years versus 12 years, that's only a few years. That's not a big difference. In the last financial accounting of the IOC, in the last quadrennial that ended in 2012, each sponsor, in terms of revenue to the IOC, paid $87 million. Okay, so a difference in duration of 4 years, one quadrennial for one Olympic sponsor is $87 million. So say if you're Lisa Baird from the USOC and you're trying to project out into the future using these durations, depending on which methodology you choose, you could be off by not just $87 million, which is one sponsor. IOC has 12 sponsors right now. If she's trying to project in the future, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in difference depending on which methodology you use. So again, I think the median lifetime is a much superior way to go. The other interesting implication of this research is every sponsorship has a duration, right? All of them start and eventually they end. And again, this survival analysis accounts for those that are still ongoing and those that have ended. So this methodology can be applied to literally any historical data set. And in fact, I'm working on 2 projects, one involving soccer shirt sponsorships, which as we all know is a huge revenue source for the soccer clubs or football clubs in England. And I'm also working on a bowl title sponsorship data set with the historical, all of the sponsors who have sponsored bowl games. As we all know, bowl games have ended when they've lost a sponsor. So that having that title sponsor is terribly important. So it's something that will be applied to a lot of different areas. The other note I'll make in terms of future research is really interesting is this is really just kind of the descriptive statistics of survival analysis. What you can actually do is you can actually apply this to model the hazard of a sponsorship ending, and you can insert covariates along the way, and you can determine, well, what actually is causing these sponsorships to fail? And that's really the exciting part of this research, and that's what I'm working on right now is inserting different covariates like whether a brand has brand equity or not, the economic conditions within the home country of the sponsor, clutter, the number of sponsors that are involved, and we're actually seeing some statistically significant predictors of the end of sponsorships. So those things can be monitored by both sides of the relationship moving forward. Hopefully I'll be able to come back next year and present that data to you, but that's kind of what I'm working on right now. This fall, I'll be teaching sports marketing at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. If you're in the area, stop by, look me up. Happy to talk with you about this stuff. There's my website, jonathanajensen.com, or I'm also on Twitter. You can look me up there. But happy if anybody has historical data sets and sponsorship, Lisa Baird from the USOC, if you're there, come call me, and I'm happy to apply this methodology to any data sets you might have, and happy to work with you moving forward. Thanks for your time.
So we have 5 minutes for Q&A if there's any questions.
He was nodding his head. He knew what I was talking about.
Hey, great, thank you. Really interesting research. I think that part 2 about the additional covariates predicting the hazard rate of various partnerships makes a lot of sense. One of the things I didn't hear you bring up when you gave those examples included things endogenous to the relationship itself, such as a goal of a sponsor is not just to keep the sponsorship, but increase the sponsorship investment year over year. Have you looked at this, and specifically, what might an increasing investment in time period previous predict will happen in the additional time period? Might we increase the size of the investment, but also risk increasing the hazard rate because now they're risking additional exposure to the sponsorship, or maybe it reduces the hazard rate?
That's a very good question. Yes, I did look at cost in terms of how much they're paying for the sponsorship. Unfortunately, for these FIFA sponsorships and these IOC sponsorships, We never know exactly how much each sponsor is paying. But I do have a data set that I'm working on right now involving collegiate athletic apparel sponsorships with public universities, where you actually have the contract between, say, Nike and Ohio State. So I am able to add it in there for that data set. But yeah, sponsorship costs in terms of how much the actual sponsor is paying is a new area of research that I'm working on. But the unfortunate problem is that most of the time you just don't know, you don't have access to the contract. But I would tend to agree with you that perhaps as costs increase, that I think one perspective is that could decrease the hazard because they're more invested in it. At the same time, it could, as you mentioned, also increase the hazard of the sponsorship ending because things are getting more and more expensive. So I think it could happen both ways, but I'll have to apply it to a data set where I know exactly how much the sponsor's paying. But great question.
Another.
Do you have any sort of information on kind of the correlation to an annual renewal sponsorship versus sort of the quadrennial format? Does it increase or decrease the hazard rate to a sponsorship?
Good question. The one nice thing about survival analysis is that it's robust enough to take any duration. So, you know, some sponsorships are 3 years, or some are 4 years, or as you mentioned, some are just a 1-year deal and then it ends. You can essentially throw any duration into a hopper. So I could do a data set looking at all sorts of durations and put them all in the same data set and just create a binary variable depicting which sponsorship it is, with 1 year, 3 year, 5 years. It can all be thrown in there. It doesn't matter what the duration is. So I haven't yet looked at sponsorships of different durations and renewal durations yet. It just so happened that with both the World Cup and Olympic sponsorships, they're 4 years in length each time. It's just kind of worked out that way, and it helps for interpretive purposes, obviously, because the time periods are the same. But I have not yet looked at different durations, but once that happens, like once I finish this bowl title sponsorship data set that I'm working on, some of those go on for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. You can throw them all in the hopper, and the methodology is robust enough to handle that. So once we start looking at different durations, then I'll let you know.
To the sponsorships which dropped but came back. And if you have any kind of quantity, that amount, percentage that came back.
It's funny you mention that. There was actually one company in my data set, Anheuser-Busch and Budweiser, that at one time was a World Cup sponsor, ended the sponsorship. In fact, it was during the time when the World Cup was here in America, and then 4 years later came back and started it again. And we had to think about how to handle that. And I did some research on it, and really it was a situation where those were really two different sponsorships. But I still, in my later on research, I still entered kind of a binary variable to control for that to make sure that it's not significant. You do have situations in this data set where you have brands that are sponsors of both, like Coca-Cola and McDonald's. And I did do some work putting in some binary variables to kind of make sure that the story I was telling wasn't just a Coke story or a McDonald's story, because Coca-Cola tends to have very long sponsorships. And it turns out it wasn't just Coke's duration that was telling the story. So I did look into that, and it has happened once, but I don't think it's something that's an issue.
I think we have time for one more question over here.
Yeah, in terms of from the sponsor perspective, did you have any insight or look into the ones that have lasted a long time, like the Coca-Colas or McDonald's? I imagine, these are two massive properties to align yourselves with, and as you get longer into it, if you're the head of sponsorships at these companies, it becomes very difficult to say, hey, I want to be the one that says, I'm going to end this. So do you have any insight into the value that the sponsors are getting longer into the partnership, and any insight into, is one of the reasons they keep doing it because what do you replace it with, and that fear?
Sure. Quantitatively, I did look at a couple of things, and it turns out brand equity in terms of a sponsor like a Coca-Cola that has a great deal of brand equity, and I used, to use in another study in the Journal of Marketing Science, I used a variable, meaning if the brand has been labeled a top 100 global brand, I put in a variable for that, and it turns out if you've been in the interbrand top 100 brands, meaning you have a great deal of brand equity, you are more likely to have a longer duration of a sponsorship. And I think I interpreted that to mean brands like Coca-Cola, they look at sponsorship as something that is not just a transactional exchange, as opposed to, there were a couple sponsors like Lenovo sponsored the Olympics when it was in China for the first time. And it was obvious that what they were doing is just looking to penetrate that Chinese market, but then as soon as the Olympic move on to another market, they ended the sponsorship. They're really more looking at it as a value-in-kind transactional exchange. Brands like Coca-Cola, they're looking at more as a brand-building exercise over time. So I have looked at that a little bit quantitatively, but I think the point you're bringing up is we also need to do some qualitative research and kind of do a mixed methods thing and talk to these brands and find out what goes into the decision whether to continue a long-term sponsorship or end it, and what are some of the factors they look at. So although today we're presenting quantitative research, I think this is something that absolutely could use a mixed methods approach, and I think that would best get at the question you're asking, the why part of it. But also the modeling that I'm doing now, looking at modeling that hazard ratio, also gets to that as well. So I think you could look at it from both a quantitative or qualitative viewpoint.
Let's give another round of applause to Professor Jensen.
Thank you.